February 24, 2022, Russian tanks crossed the Ukrainian border. Vladimir Putin has just launched the largest military invasion in Europe since 1945. Meanwhile, more than 1,000 kilometers further north, another country is watching these images in horror. Finland. Because the Finns have already lived through this scenario. 80 years earlier, in 1939, Finland had already had to face what was then the Soviet Union. As the world plunged into the Second World War, a parallel war was taking place in the vast frozen expanses of the far north. The Winter War. But that's not all, because in total, Finland experienced 3 successive conflicts between 1939 and 1945. First against the USSR, then against the Allies alongside Nazi Germany, before finally turning its weapons against the Third Reich. Yeah, okay, I know it sounds complicated when you put it like that, but you'll understand everything. Today I'm going to tell you the strange story of Finland during the Second World War. The story of a small country of barely 3 million inhabitants caught up in the greatest conflict of all time, and which, willing to do anything to preserve its independence, found itself having to make some questionable choices. But before we go any further, a little anecdote. Less than a year after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in 1946, the United States carried out a series of nuclear tests in a remote part of the Pacific, the Bikini Atoll. Until 1958, 23 nuclear explosions would shake this little corner of paradise, including Castle Bravo, the most powerful hydrogen bomb ever tested by the Americans. In 1999, Finland was a fairly young country. For several centuries, it had remained a province of the Kingdom of Sweden, until the Napoleonic Wars came and redrew the map of Europe. In 1809, following a war between Sweden and Russia, Finland became a Grand Duchy, meaning a semi-autonomous province of the Russian Empire. But at the end of the 19th century, as Russian authorities tried to Russify Finland, ideas of independence and a strong nationalist sentiment began to develop. So, when the Russian Revolution broke out in 1917, Finland took the opportunity to declare its independence. However, just like the rest of the Russian Empire, Finland also descended into civil war. It was an extremely bloody war between the Bolshevik Reds and the anti-communist Whites. The Whites received support from Germany, which sent an expeditionary force of 10,000 men. But here, unlike what happened in Russia, it was the Whites who ended up winning in May 1918. The civil war was extremely brutal. It caused 30,000 deaths, which is a terrible toll for such a sparsely populated country. After that, Finland became a liberal democracy. The Communist Party was banned, and some of its members were forced into exile, finding refuge with their Soviet neighbor. During the 1920s and 1930s, the country managed to recover from the civil war. But still, a threat continued to loom over Finland. The Soviet Union. For example, Stalin, who took power at the end of the 1920s, viewed Finland with suspicion. To him, it was a stronghold of anti-communist Whites. But above all, there was a major border problem. The Finnish border was only a few dozen kilometers from Leningrad. Stalin therefore feared that Finland could serve as a launching pad for a possible invasion of the USSR if the liberal democracies ever decided to unite against him. So tensions remained high between the Finns and the Soviets, symbolized by the construction of a major line of fortifications, the Mannerheim Line. A kind of Maginot Line, but Finnish style. To avoid a conflict, the two countries signed a non-aggression pact together in January 1932. But the balance remained fragile. In 1933, a certain Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany. And from that point on, Europe became a real powder keg in the years that followed. During the rest of the 1930s, Finnish and Soviet diplomats regularly argued over border issues, never managing to reach an agreement. As a result, behind the scenes, Stalin began to grow impatient. That's when an opportunity presented itself to him. In August 1939, a real bombshell took place that shocked all of Europe. Not feeling ready to face the Nazi threat, Stalin tried to buy time and signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler, who on his side wanted to deal with Poland and France first before attacking the Soviet Union. But that's not all. By signing this pact, the two countries agreed on a secret clause that gave Stalin free rein to seize half of Poland, the Baltic states, and Finland. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. The Second World War had just begun. And while the world's eyes are fixed on burning Warsaw, Stalin now has his hands free. Within a few weeks, he seizes eastern Poland, begins his annexation of the Baltic states, and is already turning his gaze toward Finland. Starting on October 5th, 1939, Stalin puts pressure on his neighbor. He offers Finland a deal. He proposes to give them land made up mostly of uninhabited forests, and in exchange the Finns must move their borders farther from Leningrad, as well as cede strategic islands in the Gulf of Finland to the Soviets. It's safe to say that this is a deal not very advantageous. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Elias Erko, who is in charge of the negotiations, knows he is isolated, but he doesn't want to lose face, so he chooses to shut the door on negotiations, flatly rejecting the Soviet proposals. Well, this position earned him a lot of criticism, as he was accused of offending Stalin and thus hastening the war, except that in reality Stalin was planning to launch a military operation anyway. Since the summer of 1939, he had already begun massing troops along the border. In fact, what Stalin is waiting for is a trigger. It's November 27th, 1939, in the small village of Mainila, a Russian village near the border, when suddenly several shells tear through the sky and blow apart the small snow-covered izbas. Immediately, the Soviet army announces that the village has just been attacked by Finnish artillery, which in effect constitutes a breach of the 1932 Non-Aggression Pact. In reality, all of this is just a setup. It was in fact the Soviets who bombed their own village. And all of this has just given Stalin the casus belli he was waiting for. On November 30th, war is declared. Facing the Soviet giant, Finland finds itself very much alone, as the rest of Europe has other things to worry about at that moment. Yet while Stalin no doubt thought he would make them yield quickly, he is about to encounter heroic resistance from the Finns. And above all, he will have to face the consequences of his own policies. The Soviet war machine is set in motion. 500,000 men, 2,000 armored vehicles, and nearly 1,000 planes launch an assault on Finland from 4 directions. In the north, the 14th Army is aiming for the Arctic Sea. In the center, the 9th is supposed to cut Finland in two. In the east, the 8th is moving up toward Lake Ladoga. And in the south, the 7th is charging from Leningrad toward Helsinki, which at the same time is being bombed by the Soviet Air Force. Given all that, it's safe to say that, on paper, Finland looks to be in serious trouble. A small nation of 3.7 million inhabitants, the country can only rely on a small professional army, a few veterans from the civil war who are still able to fight, and above all on its civilian population, which is hastily mobilized, allowing Finland to scrape together, with difficulty, 300,000 men. But having men is one thing, you also need to be able to equip them, and that's where things get more complicated. The Finns lack everything. Only the professional soldiers have uniforms. Those who are mobilized are simply given a rifle, a few rounds of ammunition, and a blue and white cockade to identify each other. Their tanks are old Renault FT-17S bought from France 10 years earlier, which they end up burying to turn into fixed artillery. And as for their air force, here too, they have only about 100 obsolete aircraft. In other words, it seems like the outcome is already decided. And yet, things are not going to go as planned. In the first days, Soviet troops push into Finnish territory. At the same time, Stalin, already thinking he'll soon be able to plant his flag in Helsinki, decides to create a people's government of the Democratic Republic of Finland. In plain terms, it's a puppet government led by an exiled communist named Otto Vilkosinen. And it's him that Stalin wants to put in charge of the country once it has been conquered. While the Kremlin hopes to see an uprising among the Finnish population, the exact opposite happens. Because with this maneuver by Stalin, the Finns clearly understand that this isn't a conflict over borders, but a fight for the survival of their nation. In fact, after this, even some Finnish communists choose to take up arms against the Soviet Union. Needless to say, the morale of the population is sky high. After the shock of the invasion, the Finns get organized. They go back to the old methods from the Civil War, creating militias made up of civilians who assist the army with supply missions or securing the rear. Women, for their part, joined the Lottasvärt in large numbers, an all-female volunteer organization. Oh, and a quick note about this symbol that appears in quite a few archival images. This cross has nothing to do with the Nazi swastika. It is a symbol that has been used for a long time in Finland, including by the armed forces. Notably the Finnish Air Force, which continued to use it for a long time afterward, and even today, the Finnish Air Force Academy still uses it. Anyway, end of the aside and back to 1939. On the ground, the soldiers improvise a lot. They move quickly on skis through the snowy forests and equip themselves by salvaging enemy weapons, which soon gives the Finnish troops some rather improbable looks. Since they lack anti-tank weapons, they use an incendiary cocktail invented during the Spanish Civil War, which will get its name during the Winter War. The Molotov cocktail, ironically named after Vyacheslav Molotov, the Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs. In short, the Soviet High Command is quickly forced to acknowledge the obvious. The Finns are resisting and resisting hard, much more than expected. On top of that, despite its superiority, the Red Army starts off with a serious handicap. And to understand this, we need to go back a few years. Between 1937 and 1938, the terrible Stalinist purges swept through the USSR. During those years, Stalin organized a fierce crackdown against all his supposed opponents. And these purges hit the army hard. It lost 35,000 officers, more than half of its generals, and 2 marshals who were arrested, imprisoned, or even executed. As a result, in 1939, the Soviet army is powerful, yes, but poorly led, paralyzed by fear, and incapable of improvising. Officers no longer dare to contradict orders, political commissars control everything, and the slightest mistake can cost you your life. On top of that, there's another factor that the Soviets had not, surprisingly, not anticipated. It's the weather. Oh, and one thing I haven't mentioned, but since this is happening in December in Finland and it's literally called the Winter War, I think you guessed it, but over there, it's freezing. After a very hot summer, the winter that sets in at the end of 1939 is absolutely freezing, even for Finland. But since the Red Army was prepared for a blitzkrieg, it wasn't ready for such conditions. With the cold, aircraft are grounded, tanks get bogged down in the snow, roads disappear, and the marshes, rivers and frozen lakes become deadly traps. Caught in the polar nights where the thermometer sometimes drops as low as -40 degrees Celsius, Soviet soldiers literally die from the cold. With the cold and the fierce resistance of the Finns, the Soviets' initial optimism is quickly swept away. The Finnish army, led by Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, a former hero of the Civil War, manages to reorganize his army and strengthen its defenses. Thus, the Soviets are systematically pushed back, as in the battles of Summa, Taipale or Kola, in which the famous Saimo Häyhä distinguished himself. With his Master 52 and his M28 rifle, the man nicknamed the White Death achieves 505 confirmed kills, supposedly making him the best sniper in history. But the greatest Finnish victory takes place above the Arctic Circle in the village of Suomussalmi, where, in -40 degrees, Colonel Silas Vuo and his men manage to encircle a Soviet column in the village, who end up dying from cold and hunger, before then succeeding in defeating the Soviet reinforcements. But despite these feats, Mannerheim too has to face the facts. His strategy of constantly striking the Soviets, like David against Goliath, results in enormous losses. Stalin, for his part, realizes that he has underestimated the enemy, so he dismisses General Voroshilov, who was leading the operations, and replaces him with General Timoshenko, who increases the troops to 900,000 men. He decides to temporarily freeze the front to rebuild his units, before resuming the assaults in January 1940, convinced that sheer numbers will bring him victory. At the same time, while the war with Germany seems to be at a standstill during what is called the Phony War, the attention of the democracies turns to Finland. The Soviet aggression causes outrage and a wave of international support emerges among the democracies. Although it declared itself non-belligerent, Sweden sends weapons and equipment to its neighbor, and a corps of Swedish volunteers is dispatched to fight. They are soon joined by Norwegian, Danish, and even British volunteers such as the future Count Dracula, Christopher Lee. France and Great Britain, for their part, have the USSR expelled from the League of Nations, the predecessor of the UN. And they even consider sending troops directly to Finland, because for them, attacking the USSR is also in a way attacking Germany. Well, the plan quickly falls through because the Scandinavian countries don't want to be drawn into the war, and so they refuse to allow Allied troops to pass through their territory. And anyway, the French and British think that sooner or later the Germans and Soviets will turn their weapons against them, and that when that happens, it will be better to have Stalin on their side. In short, despite international aid, it isn't enough to tip the balance in favor of the Finnish cause. Since the resumption of offensives in January, the Soviets have managed to break through Finnish defenses and reach the city of Viborg, which opens the way to the capital, Helsinki. With their backs against the wall, the Finnish government has no choice but to agree to resume negotiations. A sign that everyone wants to put an end to it? In less than 2 weeks, the situation is settled. On March 13, 1940, at 1 a.m., peace is signed. Finland remains independent, but the price to pay is heavy. The country is forced to cede 10% of its territory to the Soviets, who take back the Karelian Isthmus up to Viborg, part of the Sala region, the Ribaki Peninsula in the north, as well as several islands in the Gulf of Finland, and a 30-year concession for the port of Hanko. Taken aback by fierce resistance, hampered by the consequences of Stalinist purges, and completely disorganized on a hostile battlefield, the Winter War has just cost the lives of more than 120,000 Soviet soldiers. The conflict has also made Stalin realize that, for now, his army is absolutely not ready to face Germany. On the other side, with 23,000 dead in a country of only 3,700,000 inhabitants, the Finns pay a heavy price. The loss of Viipuri, the country's second largest city and an industrial center, is also a severe blow. On top of that comes the influx of thousands of displaced Finns who must leave their land. Within Finnish society, this peace treaty is considered far too harsh. And unsurprisingly, a deep desire for revenge begins to emerge. And there's one country that notices this: Germany. And Hitler won't take long to come knocking at Helsinki's door. Following the Winter War, a period begins that will be called the Great Truce. While at the same time Nazi Germany continues to subjugate Europe by bringing down France in the spring of 1940, Finland for its part more or less disappears from the radar. Still marked by the Winter War, the Finnish government launches an intense propaganda campaign calling for a renewed fight to reclaim the lost territories. But this time, Finland does not want to face the Soviet colossus alone. But the problem is potential allies are few and far between. Sweden has declared itself neutral, and Norway and Denmark have just fallen into German hands. Germany, with whom the Finns have fond memories, since it was Germany that helped them crush the Reds in 1918. Well, the issue is that at this point it's not really the same Germany anymore. And what's more, it's still bound to the USSR by a non-aggression pact. Except here's the thing. On June 22, 1941, Hitler decides to break the pact made with Stalin and launch Operation Barbarossa. Immediately, Finland takes up arms again and takes advantage of the chaos sown by the Germans to attack the Soviet Union. This is the beginning of the Continuation War. The country even takes a decisive step. It signs an agreement with Nazi Germany to receive equipment and weapons. The two countries thus become, in effect, co-belligerents in the war against the Soviet Union. 5 German divisions, including an SS unit, even settle in the north of the country. Thanks to this support, it takes the Finns only a few weeks to retake the territories lost in 1940, and even go beyond them. But be careful, Mannerheim refuses to go any further. For example, he ignores the orders of the Wehrmacht when they ask him to march on Leningrad, because that would make Finland an ally of the Nazis, causing it to lose its pretext of waging a defensive war against the USSR. There's also no question of signing a direct alliance with Hitler, so Finland is not part of the Axis. Despite strong nationalism, Finland remains a democracy and does not share the fascist ideology at all. But it must be acknowledged that Finland's position remains ambiguous. Because by fighting alongside the Third Reich, it directly serves its own interests. These ties sometimes even go beyond mere co-belligerence. For example, Finnish volunteers joined the ranks of the Waffen-SS within the Viking unit. Or there were a few cases where Jews were handed over by the Finnish authorities to the Germans without asking too many questions. Or, on June 4, 1942, for Mannerheim's 75th birthday, the Marshal received a visit from Adolf Hitler himself aboard his personal train. The Führer comes to flatter him and try to convince him to intensify the war effort against Stalin. That is why, despite its precautions, Finland is seen as an ally of the Nazis. In fact, Great Britain declared war on Finland in 1941, and then it was the United States' turn in 1944, even though no fighting ever took place between them. However, despite Hitler's flattery, Mannerheim remains cautious. He knows that the tide can turn. And in fact, well, it does turn. At the beginning of 1943, the Germans surrender at the Battle of Stalingrad. After failing to take Moscow the previous winter, the Wehrmacht is now forced to retreat on the Eastern Front. The Finns then realize that Hitler will not win the war. Fearing that Finland might turn against them, the Germans try to force their hand to sign an alliance, but they categorically refuse. From that point on, the Finns and Soviets no longer really fight each other. It is not until June 9, 1944 that Stalin decides to settle the Finnish question by launching a major offensive. In 1 month of deadly fighting, the Finns are crushed and forced to retreat. The front line then stabilizes where it had stopped in 1940. Stalin decides not to press the issue as his priority is to reach Berlin before the Americans. That is why he agrees to end the war quickly. On September 19th, the Moscow armistice is concluded. Finland remains independent and thus escapes the fate of the other Eastern European countries by not becoming a satellite state of the USSR. On the other hand, the Soviet Union regains the lands it conquered during the Winter War, plus the Petsamo region in the north, which permanently cuts off Finland's access to the Arctic. But as the saying goes, things always come in threes. A third conflict breaks out in September 1944, the Lapland War. Except this time, it's not against the Soviets. Because in the Moscow armistice, there's a clause that forces the Finns to drive the German troops out of their territory. So at the end of 1944, the Finns turn their weapons against the 200,000 Wehrmacht soldiers who are still stationed in Lapland. It's a war just as intense as the previous ones, which will last until April 1945, causing the destruction of many villages in Lapland, victims of the scorched earth strategy carried out by the Germans during their retreat. Finding itself successively at war with the USSR, the Allies and then Nazi Germany, Finland thus played a unique role in the Second World War. During the Winter War, it managed to stand up almost alone against the Soviet giant, making this conflict a symbol of resistance and courage deeply rooted in Finnish identity. But this story is also more complex. To survive, the country had to make compromises with Nazi Germany. Without ever embracing its ideology, Finland became an ally of circumstance. A strategic choice that the collective memory of the Finns often prefers to leave in the shadows. When the Second World War ended and the world was divided between the capitalist bloc and the communist world, Finland chose to take a different path. In 1948, Finland signed a treaty with the Soviet Union obliging it to remain neutral during the Cold War. This is what is known as Finlandization. Basically, Finland remains an independent liberal democracy while maintaining good neighborly relations with Moscow and keeping its distance from Washington. This neutrality is maintained by Finland throughout the entire Cold War and even after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But everything changed on February 24, 2022. Kiev was the target of several bombings. The events of that night are a turning point in the history of Europe and in our country's history. When Vladimir Putin launched his invasion of Ukraine, the specter of the Winter War immediately resurfaced. Once again viewing Russia as a threat and fearing being left alone once more, Finland decided to break with its historic neutrality and join NATO in 2023. More than 80 years after facing the Red Army on skis and with Molotov cocktails, the Finnish army is once again on a war footing. Its border with Russia stretches for over 1,300 kilometers, making it potentially the main direct front line between the Atlantic Alliance and Russia. And as military exercises multiply in the frozen forests of the far north, some are wondering if history could repeat itself. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it.